You've probably never thought about this. But hidden somewhere in the smoke of your most distant ancestors' campfires is a story tens of thousands of years old. Fire gave you warmth, light, protection from predators. But fire gave you something else too, smoke. And that smoke once changed the way humans communicate with the world around them, with spirits, with gods, with each other. The story of that smoke is far more complex, and far more serious than it first appears. Let's start at the beginning. Archaeologist Andrew Sherratt, who studied the connections between plants, culture, and archaeology, noted that almost every human society on the planet eventually found a plant whose smoke was used for ritual, religious, or medicinal purposes. This isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern, repeating itself again and again in wildly different corners of the world, independently of each other. But it's important to understand the difference right from the start. What ancient people did was, in most cases, nothing like the modern idea of smoking. It was a rare, ritual, carefully controlled act, not a daily habit available to anyone at any moment. Take North and South America. Archaeological finds, including smoking pipes over 2,000 years old, discovered across what is now the United States, show that indigenous peoples used tobacco long before European contact. But they used it in a way you might not expect. Tobacco historian Jordan Goodman, author of a major study on the history of the plant, points out that for many indigenous peoples of North America, tobacco was a sacred plant, used in ceremonies, in the sealing of agreements between tribes, in healing rituals. An ordinary person didn't smoke tobacco every day for pleasure. It was an act loaded with meaning, often reserved for specific circumstances, councils of elders, moments of important decisions, times of spiritual significance. Picture it. Smoke is language. Smoke is a way to speak to something larger than everyday life. When two rival groups sat down to share a single pipe passed in a circle, that wasn't just an act of inhaling smoke, it was a symbolic act, sealing an agreement with words that could not be broken. The legendary, peace pipe, you may have heard about in films was nothing like the casual pastime it's sometimes portrayed as. It was a serious, formal ritual with strict rules: who could smoke first, in which direction the pipe was passed, what words were spoken before and after. Now let's move to another continent. In Africa, archaeologists have found clay pipes, smoking implements, and traces of various plants, including cannabis, in some regions, long before the colonial period. Research conducted in Ethiopia uncovered clay pipes with cannabis residue roughly 1,000 years old. Once again, context matters. In most documented cases, we're talking about traditional practices, often spiritual or medicinal, embedded in the culture of a specific region, not everyday recreation. It's worth pausing here to say something plainly. The use of psychoactive substances, whether in ancient times or today, carries real health risks. The fact that a practice existed for thousands of years doesn't make it safe, just as the ancient practice of bloodletting doesn't make it good medicine. History shows us that people sought ways to interact with altered states of consciousness. It doesn't tell us this was good for their bodies. Let's move further, into Asia. Chinese written sources, dating back several thousand years, mention the practice of fumigating rooms with the smoke of certain herbs for healing and purification purposes. This is different from a person directly inhaling smoke, but it reveals the same underlying pattern. Smoke is a mediator between the world of the living and something unseen, whether illness, spirit, or deity. In parts of India and Nepal, ancient traditions still survive involving the use of smoke from certain plants in religious ceremonies tied to Hindu and Buddhist practices. And again, the context is tightly regulated. This isn't an everyday act performed by an ordinary person, but part of a much wider spiritual system, often accessible only to initiates, or during specific festivals in the yearly cycle. Let's return to the science. Why did people start inhaling the smoke of certain plants in the first place? This is where the truly interesting part of the story begins. Fire itself is the greatest discovery in the history of cooking, as anthropologist Richard Wrangham notes in his well-known work on human evolution. But fire had a side effect. When certain plants end up in the flames, intentionally or by accident, they release smoke containing specific chemical compounds. Some of those compounds affect the nervous system of whoever breathes them in. Early humans probably noticed this by accident. Maybe someone threw not just wood but a bundle of wild herbs onto the fire. Maybe smoke from a particular plant, trapped in the enclosed space of a cave, produced unfamiliar sensations in the people gathered there. History hasn't preserved the exact moment of this discovery, but it has preserved its consequences. Once people noticed the effect, a long process of trial, observation, and eventually ritualization began. Archaeobotanist Julie Hogarth, who has studied plant remains at ancient human sites, points out that the ability to recognize and use plants with particular properties was part of a much broader body of knowledge held by ancient communities. Just as they knew which berries were poisonous and which were edible, they gradually learned which smoke produced which sensations. This knowledge wasn't passed down through books. It was passed down through experience, through stories told around the fire, through elders teaching younger members of the tribe.